When Keanu Reeves walked onto the set of The Steve Harvey Show, the energy in the studio was light. People expected charm, laughs, maybe a few behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories. Steve was ready, cards in hand, grin on his face, fully prepared to guide the conversation like he always did, with humor and heart. But something shifted, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but quietly. Keanu's eyes had locked onto something, a small crucifix resting on Steve's chest. And with that one glance, the entire tone of the room began to change. What began as a friendly interview was about to become something much deeper. Because in the next few minutes, Steve Harvey wouldn't be the one asking the questions. He'd be the one holding back tears. And what Keanu Reeves was about to say would leave millions speechless. Now, before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications if stories of healing, grace, and unexpected moments of truth matter to you. Because here on Legends and Stories, we go beyond fame. We reveal the heart behind the legend. Let's begin. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the audience settled in. That familiar theme music faded into the background as Steve walked across the stage, his signature half-grin lighting up the room. He had done this 1,000 times before, but tonight felt different. He couldn't explain it, not yet, but something about the air, the stillness, felt sacred. With a warm voice full of admiration, Steve began his introduction. "People call him the kindest man in Hollywood," he said to growing applause. "The internet calls him the last good guy left." He paused, then added, "Me? I call him the realest example of grace I've ever seen." The crowd erupted in cheers as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage. He wore dark jeans, a plain black shirt, and a black blazer. Nothing flashy, nothing trying to impress. Just Keanu. He smiled softly, gave a shy wave, and nodded to the audience. He looked almost uncomfortable with the attention, like he never truly got used to it, even after all these years. As he sat beside Steve, the room shifted again. No longer a stage. Something deeper was forming. They began to talk about movies, yes, about Hollywood, sure, but then about life. About pain, about moving through the world without armor, even when life gives you every reason to build it. And just when the audience thought they knew where this interview was going, Keanu leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "Can I tell you something I've never revealed in public?" Steve didn't speak right away. He just looked at Keanu, really looked at him. There was something in Keanu's eyes. Not just vulnerability, but weight. Like whatever he was about to say had lived inside him for a long time, untouched, waiting. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. Keanu took a slow breath, then looked at the small crucifix on Steve's chest again. "There was a night," he began quietly, "when I didn't think I'd see the morning." The words hit like thunder wrapped in a whisper. The room went still. Keanu sat back, fingers gently folded, his voice barely above the hum of the cameras. "I wasn't filming a movie. I wasn't doing press. I wasn't even pretending to be okay anymore. I was alone, completely alone. And it wasn't just silence around me. It was inside me." Steve's smile faded. His body leaned forward slightly, instinctively. He knew this wasn't for the crowd. This wasn't for TV. This was man to man, spirit to spirit. "What happened?" Steve asked gently. Keanu's eyes dropped for a second. "I had lost everything. My daughter, my partner, my ability to believe that anything ahead of me could matter again." A few quiet gasps escaped the audience. Most people had heard the rumors about Keanu's past, tragedies whispered through tabloids, But this wasn't a headline. This was the pain behind it. I couldn't sleep, Keanu continued. Couldn't eat. Couldn't feel. I would sit in my apartment in complete darkness. No music, no TV, no distraction, just waiting. He paused, and I didn't even know what I was waiting for. Steve's hands were now clasped tightly. The crucifix rested quietly over his heart. But then, Keanu said, his voice softer, I came across a video. He looked up, meeting Steve's eyes. It was you. Steve blinked, stunned. Me? You were on stage. You weren't trying to be funny. You weren't performing. You were just talking about faith, about storms, about how God doesn't waste pain. Steve's expression shifted, recognition creeping in. I remember that clip, he said, almost to himself. I watched it 3 times, Keanu said, not because I understood everything, but because it made me feel something. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. The crowd was silent now, not a single shuffle, not a cough, just that kind of stillness that only comes when something sacred is unfolding. You said something I'll never forget, Keanu continued. If you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. Steve's lips parted slightly, his throat tight. That night, Keanu said, I got up. I didn't fix everything. I didn't smile. But I stood, and I haven't stopped standing since. Steve looked down, touched the crucifix again, and took a long breath. That moment saved me, Steve, Keanu added, his voice steady now. And you didn't even know. Steve shook his head, visibly moved. I was just talking from the heart. That's what made it real. They looked at each other, 2 men from different worlds, bonded by a single invisible thread. And then, Keanu said something that shifted the air once again. You think you're just a host, a comedian, a guy with a mic and a grin. He leaned forward. But I think you're something else. Steve tilted his head. What? Keanu's voice was calm, sure, and soaked in quiet reverence. I think you're a minister in disguise. Steve's eyes welled. The audience remained still. No applause, no laughter, just presence. That's when Keanu leaned back in his seat, the memory clearly still alive inside him. Steve, I've never told anyone this, but you should know. That crucifix you wear, it's not just a symbol. He paused. It's a message, and someone like me needed that message more than you'll ever know. Steve closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed. And in that silence, something incredible began to happen. This wasn't just a moment. It was a ministry. The entire studio fell still. No one knew what Keanu was about to share. But something in his tone, soft, reverent, warned them that it wasn't just another celebrity anecdote. It was something sacred. Steve leaned in, sensing the shift. The cue cards in his hand slowly dropped to his lap as his focus narrowed to the man in front of him. There was a night, Keanu began, not that long ago, when I wasn't sure I wanted to keep going. He said it plainly. No dramatic pause, no build-up, just the truth. A wave of silence rolled across the audience. People blinked, leaned forward, captivated by the weight in his words. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was drowning in this silence, Keanu continued. Not the kind that's peaceful, the kind that presses against your chest, makes you forget how to breathe. Steve didn't speak. He simply rested his hand gently over the crucifix on his chest. Keanu's voice softened, almost to a whisper. And one night, I was just scrolling, my phone in one hand, the other gripping the edge of my bed like it was the only thing keeping me here. He looked up, locking eyes with Steve. And then I saw you. Steve's eyebrows furrowed. Me? Keanu nodded. You were on stage, talking about storms, about how God doesn't waste pain, about how even if you're not where you thought you'd be, you're still right where you're needed. Steve leaned back slightly, his eyes already watering. He remembered that talk. It was never meant to go viral. It wasn't even part of the program. It was just something he needed to say that night. Keanu went on, and I remember thinking, this man, he's not trying to preach. He's not trying to impress. He's just being real. He took a deep breath. I watched that clip 3 times, and then, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed. There were tears in the audience now, silent, reverent. Keanu leaned in again. I never told anyone this, not my friends, not my agent, not my family. But that moment, that video, it saved me. Steve blinked hard, lips trembling. I was just trying to talk from my heart, Steve whispered. I didn't know. Keanu shook his head gently. That's just it. You didn't have to know. That's what made it real. Then came the moment that no one in the studio, or watching online, would ever forget. Keanu pointed to the crucifix on Steve's chest. That symbol? It wasn't just a cross that night. It was a lighthouse, in the dark. Steve's hand instinctively rose and touched it again. His eyes, glistening with emotion, didn't leave Keanu's. And then Keanu said it, so softly it felt like a prayer. You think you're just a comedian with faith, but I think you're a minister in disguise. Steve gasped. The audience froze, and for a moment, the bright lights of television disappeared. They were no longer 2 men on a stage. They were 2 souls in conversation about pain, purpose, and the quiet ways we lift each other when no one else is watching. And Steve? He was speechless. He'd made millions laugh. But now, he was fighting back tears. And the world? The world was watching something real. The silence in the studio was almost holy. Steve sat frozen, one hand still holding the crucifix at his chest, the other wiping away a tear he didn't even realize had fallen. Keanu remained still, calm. But there was a storm of emotion behind his eyes. And yet, he wasn't shaken. He wasn't trying to dramatize. He was just present. And that presence spoke louder than any applause ever could. Steve finally whispered, I don't even know what to say. Keanu leaned in. You don't have to say anything. You already said it. Years ago. When I needed it the most. The crowd wasn't breathing. People in the front row had tears streaking down their cheeks. Even the cameramen, trained to stay stoic, blinked rapidly, trying to keep it together. Keanu's voice softened again. Steve, you reminded me that silence doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes, it's the space where healing begins. Steve looked at him, eyes still wet. You talk about silence like it's familiar. Keanu paused, then nodded slowly. It is. He sat back, his hands folding gently in his lap. There was a season, he said, when I didn't want to wake up. When I couldn't tell the difference between night and day, because neither felt safe. The audience listened like they were listening to scripture. I had lost people, not just to death, but to time, to grief, to life itself. His voice didn't tremble, but it cut deep. My daughter, she was stillborn. A gasp escaped from someone in the crowd. And then, just a few weeks later, Keanu continued, Jennifer, the love of my life. She was gone too. Steve covered his mouth. The pain in Keanu's voice was subtle, but it carried a weight that filled the entire room. I didn't cry right away, Keanu added. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, so quiet, that you forget you're alive. Now the tears were flowing across the studio. Keanu kept speaking, not to impress, not to shock, but because it was time. I kept working, kept doing interviews, kept playing roles, because disappearing behind a character was easier than being myself, when myself was broken. Steve nodded, slowly. Keanu glanced at him again. You understand that, don't you? Steve didn't answer with words, just a look, a knowing one. But eventually, Keanu said, the noise outside couldn't drown out the silence inside. And one night, that silence almost won. Everyone was still, frozen. Keanu looked around the studio, not for attention, but as if to acknowledge the people who were bearing witness. I sat in the dark for hours, not thinking, not praying, just existing. I didn't even want to move. He took a breath, and that's when I picked up my phone. Steve swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming. I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't even looking for hope. I just didn't want to feel nothing. Keanu's eyes glistened now, and I saw a clip. It was you, on a stage, talking about storms, talking about faith, talking about how God doesn't waste pain. Steve blinked. He remembered the clip. It wasn't rehearsed, wasn't part of any show, just something he felt in his spirit that night and decided to say. You said, Keanu recalled, if you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. The room broke. A woman in the audience clutched her chest. A man near the back buried his face in his hands. Keanu leaned forward again, and for some reason, those words hit different. They felt like someone finally saw me. Not the actor, not the Hollywood guy, just the man in the dark. Steve was fully crying now. No shame, no holding back. You weren't just talking, Keanu said. You were testifying. The words landed heavy. You thought you were just doing a segment, but what you were doing was lifting someone who didn't have the strength to stand. Steve nodded slowly, his body trembling. I needed to tell you, Keanu whispered, because the world knows you as a comedian, a host, a motivator. He paused, but I don't think that's the full truth. Steve looked at him, eyes glassy, lips parted. Keanu's voice dropped again. I think you're a minister in disguise. There was a hush, not a silence of discomfort, but one of reverence, a stillness that could only exist in the presence of something real. I think God gave you that mic not just to make people laugh, Keanu said, but to speak life. Steve looked away, overwhelmed, and Keanu finished with this. You weren't trying to save me, but you did. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't move. They simply sat in the holy weight of what had just been said. And in that moment, no one was watching a talk show. They were witnessing a resurrection. The studio remained still. There was no applause, no music, no movement, just Steve Harvey, sitting in silence, tears in his eyes, as the weight of Keanu's words settled into the air like sacred dust. He wiped his face slowly, trying to catch his breath, not from physical exhaustion, but from something deeper, something spiritual. Keanu, too, sat quietly. He wasn't looking for a reaction. He wasn't performing. He had simply told the truth. And in doing so, he had pulled back the curtain on pain, on faith, on what it means to carry hope. Quietly. Steve finally spoke, his voice hoarse. You remembered all of that? Keanu nodded slowly. I had to. Because I wasn't just listening to you, Steve. I was being lifted by you. There was another pause, this time not heavy, but full of memory, full of grace. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. You know, he said softly, there were nights I didn't think I mattered either. I was just trying to survive, trying to make people laugh to forget my own pain. Keanu looked over, his eyes kind. And that's what made it real. Steve nodded, lips trembling. I never wanted to be a preacher, never thought I was good enough to carry something sacred. Keanu's voice was calm. That's why it was given to you. Steve turned toward him. People don't need perfect, Keanu said. They need honest. They need broken but still standing. They need the guy who knows what it's like to cry in silence and still get up and smile for the world. The audience, still quiet, sat as if afraid to even blink. Steve swallowed hard. Sometimes I wonder why God would pick someone like me. And then Keanu leaned in again. Not dramatically, but with purpose. I'll tell you why, he said, voice steady as stone. Because you speak a language that pain understands. Steve's eyes widened slightly, like something had just clicked. Keanu continued, You didn't go to seminary. You didn't memorize scripture. But God trusted you with a microphone. Because your story, your scars, carry more power than 100 sermons. He paused again. And I think you forgot that. So tonight, I needed to remind you. Steve's lips parted, but no sound came out. So Keanu spoke again. You said something once, something that stuck to my bones. You said, sometimes you're not the one being rescued. You're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. A few sniffles echoed through the crowd. Keanu's voice softened. You weren't trying to be a hero, Steve, but you became one. Not because you had answers, but because you dared to speak, even when you didn't. And then Keanu reached out and gently placed his hand over Steve's. That one gesture said everything. You carried faith into places that had none left, Keanu said, including me. Steve's head lowered. His shoulders shook. He was crying, yes, but not from sorrow, from release, from knowing he wasn't just a man with a mic, but a vessel for something greater. Then, in the softest voice yet, Keanu whispered, Steve, you matter. Not for what you do, but for who you are. The studio was still. Then, slowly, Steve stood. He didn't speak. He didn't try to pull the moment back into entertainment. He simply rose and reached for Keanu. And Keanu stood too. And they embraced. Not as celebrity and host, but as two men, both shaped by pain, both walking miracles of quiet endurance. The audience rose, not to cheer, but because it felt right, reverent, sacred. Steve turned to the crowd, his voice barely above a whisper. I've had a lot of moments on this stage, but this was the greatest gift I've ever received. Then he paused and said something no one expected. Let's pray. In that studio, under the hot lights, surrounded by cameras and producers and stage managers, the world paused. Steve bowed his head, and Keanu closed his eyes beside him. No script, no spotlight, just silence, and the sound of hearts opening. That night, millions of people didn't just watch a show. They witnessed healing. And the next morning, the headlines weren't about scandal or gossip. They were about something rare, something sacred. Steve Harvey and Keanu Reeves share a moment that shook the world. A talk show became a testimony. This is what grace looks like. Social media lit up, not with hot takes or memes, but with gratitude, with people sharing their own stories of grief, of faith, of being lifted by someone who didn't even know they were lifting. And somewhere, in a small, quiet room, Keanu Reeves sat with a notebook, scribbling down a few more thoughts. He wrote, Faith isn't loud. It doesn't beg for attention. It whispers, you're not alone. And sometimes, that's all someone needs to keep going. He closed the notebook and smiled. Because that night wasn't about him. It wasn't about fame. It was about two men, reminding the world that light still breaks through, even in the quietest places. And somewhere, someone watching from the dark got up.